End of the service, we'll talk some more about it. But I want us to learn to be grateful for our mamas, even if they were the worst mama on the planet. The reason is you're here because of her. You understand? And you have an opportunity to be different. That's up to you. Okay? So, I don't normally do this. Some of you who know the Bible, who read the Bible on a regular basis, know that Proverbs 31 is basically a story about a virtuous woman. Now, I'm going to take a little different slant at this. You know, I love history, and so I really dive into the history side of it. Proverbs 31, in my opinion, should have been Proverbs number 1. And we're going to dive into that in just a minute. You ready? Did I bait you enough to go, okay, we're ready? All right, okay. Here we go. So, Proverbs 31 on this Mother's Day. Chapter 31, verse 1. This is the last of the Proverbs. The Proverbs are written by Solomon, wisest man that ever lived. Sometimes I question if he was really the wisest man that ever lived, and you'll see why in a minute. The sayings of King Lemuel contain this message, which his mother taught him. O my son, O son of my womb, O son of my vows, do not waste your strength on women, on those who ruin kings. It is not for kings, O Lemuel, to guzzle wine. Rulers should not crave alcohol, for if they drink, they may forget the law and not give justice to the oppressed. Alcohol is for the dying, and wine is for those in bitter distress. Let them drink to forget their poverty and remember their troubles no more. Speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves. Ensure justice for those being crushed. Yes, speak up for the poor and helpless and see that they get justice. Now, when you read that first part there, this is a mama advising her son and calling her son out. Now, when you read that, you go, okay, wait a minute, who's King Lemuel or Lemuel? Who is that? Well, let me tell you something I discovered. Lemuel in Hebrew means devoted to God. Now, how many know the story of Solomon? How God said, Solomon, I want you to build my temple. I'm not going to let David do it because his hands are too bloody. Why was his hands bloody? Because they used to sing songs about him. Saul has killed his thousands, but David has killed his 10,000s. And David said, but I want to build the temple. And God says, I'm sorry, your hands are too bloody. He says, can I at least gather all the material? I think that's kind of cool. And so David gathered all the material to build the temple. But Solomon built it because he was devoted to God. You notice the name Lemuel, devoted to God. And who is Solomon? He's devoted to God. I believe, I've read several theologians in it and say, who is this King Lemuel? And they all get to arguing back and forth over it. None of them can come up with an opinion. So I asked God about it one day. I said, Father, I want to know who this King Lemuel is. And he says, it's Solomon. It's simple. See, usually what's in front of our face is real. It's how our perspective changed or how much information we get that actually messes with it. Well, why does she call him Lemuel? I don't know. Why did your mama call you Knucklehead? Why did your mama call you a name at all? Good mamas always had a pet name for their child, right? And in Hebrew, the pet name was, maybe she didn't say Lemuel. Maybe she said devoted to God, which meant Lemuel. See what I mean? She's talking to Solomon. How do I know this? Look at what she talks about. She talks about drinking too much, carousing too much as a king, and then hanging out with these women that he ought not to be hanging out with. Let me ask you a question. What was Solomon's downfall? All these women. Now, was it the woman's fault? No. It's what she represented. And you go, what do you mean? He was marrying for diplomacy. That's a terrible reason to marry. There's no love involved. There's no commitment involved. It's all a transaction to make sure that we don't go to war against one another because I'm going to marry your daughter, or you're going to marry my princess, or you're going to, so that we don't fight. That's all that is. But what did God warn Solomon about? Be careful about foreign women. You will begin to worship their gods. So what was his downfall? It actually wasn't women. His downfall is he didn't listen to his mother. Think about that a minute. Just let that sink in. Now do you see why I say this should have been Proverbs number 1? If Solomon would have ran his life through Proverbs 31, we would be reading a different story. I don't know that Ecclesiastes would have even been written. There's so much there. That doesn't make me an authority on the Bible. What that means is that I'm trying to understand why Proverbs 31 is there. Okay? Now, then it all changes. Verse 10, who can find a virtuous and capable wife? She is more precious than rubies. Her husband can trust her, and she will greatly enrich his life. She brings him good, not harm, all the days of her life. That is the way it's supposed to be. I know some of you are in the room, and that's not the way it was. But hang with me. It's going to get better. She finds wool and flax and busily spins it. She is like a merchant ship bringing her food from afar. She gets up before dawn to prepare breakfast for her household and plan the day's work for her servant girls. She goes to inspect a field and buys it. With her earnings, she plants a vineyard. She is energetic and strong and a hard worker. She makes sure her dealings are profitable and her lamp burns late into the night. Do you notice what I like about this woman she's describing? She's not so subservient that she doesn't exist. Because that's what most women who buy into the feminist movement, that's what they think men are expecting. But that's not what this virtuous woman is it? She's a businesswoman. She's a mother. She takes care of her household. She hires servant girls, which means she's an employer. Look at all the different facets this woman has to her. Her husband is proud of her. In fact, can't function without her. Right? Watch this. Her hands are busy spinning thread. My goodness, even with servants and everything else, she's still spinning her own thread. Right? Her fingers twisting fiber. She extends a helping hand to the poor and opens her arms to the needy. She has no fear of winter for her household, for everyone has warm clothes. In other words, she thinks about the future. She makes her own bedspreads. You know, my wife does some quilting, and my wife is an interesting character, just so you know. My wife is one of those people who she sees something and she gets intrigued by it. She says, I got to learn how to do that. You know what that means? Jim, roll your sleeves up. Everything we're going to do is be focused on that now. And man, I'm putting the quilting rack together. I'm trying to make sure that rascal will fit in this little bitty room, right? But she had the grandkids in there yesterday, even a daughter-in-law to be. And what are they doing? Cutting up fabric to make a quilt. And each one's sewing their own, and one's ironing over there, and I walk by and I go, I have a virtuous woman. She makes her own bedspread. She dresses in fine linen and purple gowns or camo. Her husband is well known at the city gates. You know, if this city had gates, I'd be well known. where he sits with the other civic leaders. She makes belted linen garments and sashes to sell to the merchants. My goodness, this woman is an entrepreneur. She is clothed with strength and dignity, and she laughs without fear of the future. Why is that? She knows that the future is in God's hands. When she speaks, her words are wise, and she gives instructions with kindness. I don't know how exactly that goes down, but I saw Jessica giving instructions to a kid that wasn't even hers out in the hallway a while ago. And she says, "Boy, you got stuff all on your face. Get in that bathroom and clean it up. You got stuff on your shirt. Who dressed you?" And I'm going, dang. So I went, "Do I got stuff on my shirt? Is there something in my..." I don't want Jessica to chew me out, because she's doing it in love. Yeah, I understand. You don't have to defend yourself, Jessica. When you bark at me, I will obey. But the reason I say this is because it's fun. That's her loving way of telling the child. Now, I'm watching the child's face the whole time, and you know what he's doing? Typical boy. Right, you going to tell me what to do? And then she said, "What'd I say?" Put a hand on her hip. "Yes, ma'am." She makes belted linen garments and sashes to sell to the merchants. She's clothed with strength and dignity. She laughs without fear of the future. When she speaks, her words are wise, and she gives instructions with kindness. That was actually kindness. Most people get offended by that. No, that's kindness. Do you want somebody to tell you've got a booger hanging out of your nose before you go preach? You want somebody to tell you that. It's not that funny. Her children, wait a minute, she carefully watches over everything in her household and suffers nothing from laziness. Her children, it does not mean she does not rest. For you mothers that are borderline workaholics, rest is good. Sit down, have a cup of coffee, and watch the birds for 5 minutes. I'm just saying. Okay? The real birds. The real birds. You know, I said that to somebody the other day, and they go, "Oh, you like the birds?" I said, "I love them." And I go, "Yeah, that group out of the late 60s, early 70s was awesome." I said, "Oh, I know, Eric Clapton. Yeah. I was talking about the birds, man." Anyway. Yeah. Her children stand, and I can always tell when Jack's in the audience. Her children stand and bless her. Her husband praises her. There are many virtuous and capable women in the world, but you will surpass them all. But you surpass them all. Why is the writer saying this? Because he cherishes. Now, if this is King Lemuel or Solomon, now this tag ending here is him talking about his mother. There is many virtuous, capable women in the world, but you surpass them all. Charm is deceptive and beauty does not last, but a woman who fears the Lord will be greatly praised. Reward her for all she has done. Let her deeds publicly declare her praise. You know, one of the reasons I could say that about Norma is because I've witnessed it. I'm going to tell you what, you did not mess with her family. Did I say that clear enough? You did not mess with her family. But if you needed something, you could ask her and she would literally give you the clothes off of her body. She would give her last $20 to you if you needed it. And she loved Randy enough to tell her the song that she needed to learn. Right? That song is a beautiful song and it is for about 10 years, it was like our theme song because so many of us came from that, right? So many of us have sordid pasts, and how do we get past that? And that song captures that, and we used to sing it nearly every month because we need to be reminded of where we came from, right? Now, what's interesting about Proverbs 31 is it's written by Bathsheba, except for the last part. And you can quote me on that, and if there's somebody online wants to argue with me about that, that's fine. I'll argue with you till the end day. Because it's obvious who wrote this. It's obvious who King Lemuel's mother was. Now let's back up a minute and look at who she was. We have a tendency to forget where she came from. As Solomon's mother, we say, oh, it's the queen mother of Israel. No, but who is she? This is Uriah's widow. Uriah's widow that was made a widow from Solomon's father, King David. I want you to see that. We have a tendency to judge Bathsheba right along with David. Let me ask you a question. What choice did she have if the king summoned her to the palace? None. What choice did she have once he started to seduce her? She could have said no. But do we know if he's going to go that far outside of the will of God, what is he going to do to her if she says no? And what was the conclusion of that affair? She lost a child. We forget that part. That first baby died. The next baby was named Nathan. You know why that is? It's because it was Nathan the prophet that called David out. And so David named that child Nathan so he would never forget what he did. But Bathsheba, interesting character. Who is her widowed husband? Uriah. Uriah the Hittite. He is not even an Israelite, but he was one of David's mighty 30. And he would die for David. Even when David slept with Uriah's wife and sent a letter to Joab and Abner or Joab and said, I want you to send Uriah home so he'll sleep with his wife. And where did Uriah sleep when we got home? On the porch. He said, why should I get to go in and sleep with my wife when all of my army buddies cannot? And so he would not. And so David wrote a letter, handed it to Uriah and said, take this back to Joab. Joab opens the letter and it says, send Uriah to the front of the line, and when the battle is heated, pull back from him. So let me ask you a question. Where did the virtuousness of of Solomon come from? Because we can all be virtuous. Virtuous means to be moral, means honest, full of integrity. So a man or a woman can be virtuous. We get those mixed up nowadays. You know, people say, oh, so-and-so in Hollywood is virtuous. No, they mean voluptuous. They're not the same thing. But we've got those confused. We don't even use that word properly anymore. Oh, they're virtuous. That means somebody I would aspire to be. Yeah, but they're a pagan witch. No, I don't aspire to be that. So why do we use that word? Because we don't even know what the word means anymore. Virtuous means to do the right thing even when nobody's looking. Virtuous means I'm going to be the best mother to Solomon I can be when I know his brothers, his stepbrothers from David's other wives, actually want to kill him? Because they were all jockeying for position when David got old, right? You remember reading those stories? So this virtuous woman that she's describing is who she aspires Solomon to marry. But because she aspires to that, she also is that. Now, I love history. You know I love history. I had somebody the other day that know me as a preacher, and they said, I'm going to come to your church on Sunday. I said, why is that? I said, well, I want to hear some history. No, you want to come hear the gospel. You don't want to come hear history. I'm not a teacher of history. I'm a teacher of the gospel of Christ who happens to love history. Right? But here's some history. How many are still doing their daily Bible reading? Look at that. Amazing. Hey, remember, you can pick up anytime. One time I forgot for like 4 months. I picked up then, and 4 months after the first year, I was done. So it still took me a year, but I was just 4 months late. All right? That's okay. Did we not read about Ruth this week? Actually, earlier in the week, we hit Judges. We finished Judges, and then we went into Ruth, right? Who is Ruth? Do you know one of the things that's said about Ruth? Boaz says, everybody knows you're a virtuous woman. Who is Ruth? Ruth is a Moabitess. Now you want to know some history on Moab? Where'd they come from? Moab was one of Lot's daughter's boys. Remember Lot, Abraham's nephew, that kept wanting to be living in Sodom and Gomorrah area? He was doing the right thing, but he was always hanging around the wrong people. And before it was all over with, everybody was killed in the region, so his 2 daughters got him drunk and slept with him. And one of those kids was Moab. So Moabites were despised by Jews. How does the book of Ruth unfold? The book of Ruth starts with, there was a famine in the land. And Elimelech decided that he was going to move over to Moab to give his family some sustenance. He moves over to Moab. No more than he gets there, he dies. Then the 2 sons, Chilion and Mahlon, get married. 10 years later, they both die. And Naomi, the mama, says, oh, God hates my guts. I don't know what's going on. She was a devout Jew, devout Hebrew. What was the problem? She had a wrong perspective of God. Let me give you a little history in that. Most people don't. They read right across this. Do you know that when God sent the famine in Israel, it was to punish them for worshiping foreign gods? And Elimelech decided he wasn't going to put up with God's punishment, so he moved him to Moab. I wonder why he died. He moved against God. And his sons were old enough to be married, which means they did the same thing. That's why they died. God don't put up with that very much. But guess what happens? Then we end up with a widow who has 2 widows for daughter-in-laws. And the widow feels like God is mad at her when in reality, she's talking to God the whole time. She even tells God, just call me Mara, which means forsaken. Why would she say that to God? Because that's what she feels. Let me tell you something you do. Don't name your children out of something you feel. You might end up with some bad names. Like Eli's daughter-in-law, one of them named their child Ichabod, which means forsaken by God. Don't name your child Ichabod. That's an emotion. Don't do that. So let's get back to the story. So what's happening? She's got these two daughter-in-laws. One's name is Orpah and one's name is Ruth. And Orpah says, I'll go with you wherever you go. Ruth says, I'll go with you wherever you go. And Naomi says, no, stay here, worship your own gods, hang out here, find new men, because even if I was to have two new boys, what, were you going to wait 20 years to marry them? No, you just go marry somebody. And Orpah said, okay. And Ruth said, no, wherever you go, I will go. Wherever your people are, they will be my people. Whatever God you serve, that will be my God. Wherever you die, I will die. Where did Ruth the Moabitess learn this? I want you to think about that. Where did she learn that from? She learned it from watching Naomi deal with her struggles. And Naomi introduced her to God Almighty, not one of the many gods that were in Moab. And so what happens is, one day Naomi says, I'm going to go back home. We have property back there. Maybe my kinsman redeemer, that was a family thing that the Hebrews did. If all of the male offspring died, there would be one of the family members who would actually redeem the property, buy it from them so they would have some way to survive. So maybe my kinsman redeemer will help me. And Ruth says, well, I'm going with you. So they go home, and Ruth and her mom are practically starving. Her mother-in-law are practically starving. And Naomi says, hey, go out to the fields, glean some wheat, get us something to eat. Well, she just so happens to end up in a field that Boaz owns. And Boaz is the kinsman redeemer. Now, I don't think, according to the story, Naomi knew that was going to happen. But once it happened, she went, oh, this is good. And now she starts to see the goodness of God coming back into her life. Not that it wasn't there all along, but then she starts telling Ruth, do this, do this, do this, do this. And then all of a sudden, Boaz, who it looks like had never been married and is probably elderly, probably 50, 60 years old, and she's in her 30s, marries her, and they have a son. And his name is Obed. And then Obed has a son, and his name is Jesse. And then Jesse has a son, and his name is David. And then David has a son, and his name is Solomon. Now, what I want you to see in this is Naomi downloaded what it was to Ruth to be virtuous. Ruth downloaded that to her son Obed, who downloaded that to his wife, if she wasn't already, who downloaded that to Jesse, who downloaded that to 8 sons, and the youngest of them being King David. And David, even though he was a man after God's own heart, had his own issues, and he was virtuous for the most part of his life, but he had times that he was not. And then he births through a woman who was virtuous named Bathsheba. He births one of the greatest kings the world has ever known. Now I want to speak to you mamas a second. Have you ever thought that when you raise your child to be a blessing to society? Or are they supposed to just fit in? No, in fact, mamas, you raise them counter to society, to be a blessing to society. Did you ever notice the story of Hannah? Hannah was the second wife of a guy in the Old Testament, in Judges, in the book of Judges. And she was barren while the first wife had like 10 kids. And the one with 10 kids would make fun of Hannah all the time. You ain't got no kids. I don't even know why you're married to the old man. And the old man saying, hey, ain't I as good as any 10 kids? What's the big deal? So what? You don't have kids. But she cried out to the Lord over and over and over, I want a child, I want a child. And God said, you know what? I'll give you a child. And she made this vow. She said, if you give me a child, when he's weaned, I will give him back to you. You know who Hannah's son was? Samuel, the prophet Samuel, who anointed David king. Look at how the story all ties together. And who is Hannah? She is a virtuous woman. And she's a virtuous woman who raised her child to be the blessing to the society around her. In fact, Samuel is known, next to Elijah, as the greatest of all the prophets. How did that happen? A virtuous woman. That's how that happened. Because it doesn't look like Hannah's husband had anything to do with it. He basically says, you name him, you do whatever you want. So at 4 years old, she hands him over to the prophet. And when he is about 6, he's asleep one night, and he hears this voice, Samuel. Samuel gets up, he goes in, says, Eli, what's up? Eli goes, I wasn't talking, go back to sleep. This happened 3 times, and finally Eli says, just say, your servant is here, speak. And so he heard it again. Samuel, your servant is here, speak, Lord. And God told him what he would do the rest of his life. How do you get character enough to do what God told you were going to do the rest of your life? It had to be downloaded from somewhere. It came from his virtuous mother. I want you to see all of these virtuous women. Some of them have names. Last week I spoke on Samson. Samson's mother was virtuous. We don't even know her name. She was just Manoah's wife. But she was amazing. Yes, I called her Rhonda just because we needed a name. And Rhonda is so Hebrew. So anyway. So my point is, be a virtuous woman. And if you haven't been, guess what's crazy? You can change that today. I'm going to tell you a story, and I'll end with this. My dad and mom found out that I was on the way in 1959 when that wasn't too kosher, and they went, oh, dang. They went to a tent revival, and they got saved. Now, a lot of people would say, okay, the story changed. Yes, but there wasn't anybody virtuous in either side of their family. Not really. And because there wasn't anybody virtuous, how do you learn that? Trial and error, baby. And I was the first child. Trial and error, baby. But you know what? My mom did the best she could do. And my mom read me the Bible every day when I was a kid. Clear up until I was 4 or 5 years old, she read it to me every day. I wonder why I read it every day. I wonder why I became a person who wanted to follow God. I wonder why His Word is written on my heart. I wonder, it's because she downloaded that. Now, my mom's not perfect. She made a lot of mistakes, and there's been a lot of differences between us through the years, but I love my mom because she did that one thing. Not only that, would she have had me in 1979? Or would it have been, I'll get somebody else? Just think about that a minute. So I'm blessed dually. Number one, she had me. Number two, she sowed into me the things that I would need my entire life, which was one thing, God and God alone. Right? Now, let's look at my dad for a second. My dad grew up in a family of alcoholics. men dying in their 50s and barely 60 for several generations. My dad lived to be 83. What happened? Oldest living male Jaeger ever. How did that happen? It's because he broke the chain. He said, I don't want to live this way anymore. And when he did that, he began to align himself with the things of God, and he would search out anybody who would sow that in him. I wonder how I got here today. My mom sowed into me virtuousness back here. My dad sowed into me virtuousness here. And even though I had this rocky middle ground, train up a child in the way they should go, and when they are old, they won't depart from it. You can be virtuous starting from today. And for those women in the room who are not mothers, let me tell you something. Motherhood is an amazing thing. But you know what the world needs now more than anything? Is virtuous mothers. And I don't care if your womb has ever opened. There's a little knucklehead that lives down the street from you who needs some mothering. Maybe he just or she just needs to hear, hey, don't you look cute today? Or, hey, would you like to come sit on my front porch and let's, talk. You talk and I'll listen. We need that more in our society now than ever. And then, what will we sow into them? Will we tell them the things of God? See, because that's the only thing that changes anything, right? I love you guys. I thank you for being with me on this Mother's Day. I know many of you have had terrible examples of mothering in your life. Some of you may not even know your mom. But there's been somebody in your life that has tried to mother you. And you need to let them. Because we need that. That side of our society is missing. Once again, I talked about the feminist movement and how it's kind of removed fathers from the home. It has also caused women to elevate themselves in such a way that's unhealthy for a family, much less society. Let's take that back. All we got to do is become virtuous. What is that? Do the things the Bible is telling us to do. Amen. Model it. Model it for the kid down the street. Model it for your grandchildren. I had it said to me yesterday. I was visiting with a man, and he says, I know so many people that are grandparents that are raising their grandchildren. What's going to happen when those grandchildren are born and there's nobody to be their parent? What's going to happen to them? We need to be downloading them into them what parenting even looks like. Even if it's Jessica style, if it's Jimmy style, right? I'll call your name and make fun of you. But then I'll make fun of myself, and then you break it all down. You go, hey. And then all of a sudden I'm in. See? How many of you saw my picture a couple weeks ago up there? Did you see that big old ear around my fist?
Yeah, my eyes still work.
I'm telling you. I had to grow into these things. See, sometimes when you make fun of yourself and you make other people laugh, it breaks all the barriers down. There's 1,000 ways to communicate. Do not be afraid. Figure it out. Ask God what He wants you to do to help somebody. Be a mother to the motherless. Right? Become virtuous. Ruth became virtuous. Bathsheba was virtuous. And neither one of them, does it look like, are even Hebrews. So we have no excuse, right? Be encouraged today and look for the one thing, if nothing else, that you can thank your mother for. That's that you exist and now God can use you. Thank you for being with me. Anybody needs to come pray, come on.